For more on this unprecedented move, let's bring in Roger Ferguson, former Fed Vice Chair, as well as a CNBC contributor. Steve Leisman's here on set. Roger, there's so many aspects of this to get to, including your sort of personal reaction to it all. But the first simple question, we've been trying to get an answer to this and been debating it all morning. Do you know if she is already fired and will now appeal that decision, or if it's the other way around, that the president needs to go to court to enforce his wishes?
That's a very good question to which I'm not sure anyone has the answer. I think eventually this will have to go to the court. There are a couple of questions. One is, what is it? First, is she guilty of anything? We do not know that yet. There are allegations. I don't think anyone has seen any proof yet that's been made public, and we should all keep that in mind. We're speculating here with a big if. Secondly, there's a question of the president's power to fire a Federal Reserve governor for cause. And what is the definition of for cause? Most people have thought for cause is for some misbehavior in office, not an alleged misbehavior as a private citizen. And so I think the question that you're asking, has she been fired, is she fired, et cetera, ultimately only the courts will be able to determine that, and we have to find out, is she guilty of anything? If so, that was if she was a private citizen. Secondly, what counts for cause to allow the president to remove a sitting Federal Reserve governor? So still some ambiguity, I think.
Certainly is a lot of ambiguity. Is that why the markets are so calm, do you think, Roger?
I think in part the markets are calm because of that. I think there is a distinction in the market's mind between, a governor and, the chairman of the board. And also we've seen this president move back and forth quite a bit on a variety of things, including tariffs. So I think the market is now, sort of conditioned itself to wait for the next shoe to drop and the one after that, and then we'll finally see where this all settles out.
Roger, what do you think the prospect is that if, in fact, and we don't know this, and maybe you can speak to like the specifics of how this works, in terms of like your badge or your paycheck that gets paid, is that something that gets authorized or revoked by the Fed chair, meaning Jay Powell has to physically do that, or is that done by somebody else?
Well, at the end of the day, Chair Powell is responsible for the whole system. But I'm not sure he's going to make these kinds of decisions, and I'm not sure anyone should be making any decisions yet based on allegations.
Right, but Roger,
here to a person who's
here's the piece of it here's where it gets complicated. If in fact he is the person who turns on and off your badge and decides whether to pay you or not, it's possible the president turns around and says, I fired her for cause, and if you're not going to enforce that firing, I'm firing you for cause.
But here's the dilemma that we're all confronting. First, does the president have the authority? Is this cause? Has she committed something that would stand up as cause to be dismissed from her constitutional office as an officer of the Federal Reserve or a governor of the Federal Reserve? That's first question. Second question is, does the chairman of the board of governors have to follow those instructions? All of this is very, very ambiguous. When I was the vice chairman of the Fed, the president ordered an evacuation of Washington, D.C. on 9/11. We did not do that at the Federal Reserve because we had taken an oath to the Constitution to uphold and defend the Constitution. It is my judgment that defending the Constitution at that moment required me to be in my office. So we have to be a little careful about this notion that anything the president says has become now immutable and must be followed. All of this will go to court, and then we'll find out first, is Lisa Cook guilty of anything? If she is guilty of something, is that sufficient cause for the president to fire her? Both big questions. If the president says that she is fired and the chairman of the board does not enforce that, is that cause? These are questions that have to be asked. You're asking the right questions, but no answers yet. And I would encourage all of us to not speculate too much.
Roger, I think it's interesting that the details matter a lot here, but we shouldn't spend too much time on the details and lose the bigger picture, which is one about Federal Reserve independence. And I want to read you what our friend Krishna Guha is writing this morning. We think asset markets are not properly priced for what increasingly seems likely to be a rupture in Fed independence and the policy reaction function in 2026. Whether or not Lisa Cook signed mortgage documents that claim two primary homes and all of that other stuff, to me pales in terms of the question for markets, which is the Fed's independence here, has it been attacked already in a meaningful way that could potentially, or maybe already has, put a chill on the decision-making process inside the central bank?
So I think you're right to take us to that bigger question, because that is, in fact, the question that matters. There's a risk. I think this unprecedented move, and there have been other moves that the president has taken vis-a-vis the Fed. All of them, I think, pile up on the side of, is the Fed's independence now being questioned? And is the Fed therefore able to make decisions consistent with its legislative mandate, which will go long past any one administration? And I think that is a very legitimate question. I think our friend Christian Guha puts it the right issue on the table for all of us to consider, and we should not be complacent about this matter whatsoever. An independent Fed, as I said to you, I think last week, is central to well-performing bond market, well-performing economy, and we need to respect and protect that independence as best we can.
Now, Roger, I don't know if this is germane at this point, but I wanted you to know that at 8:09 last night, the story I was planning to talk about this morning was one where the Fed chair was deemed to be very dovish or overly dovish by some of his colleagues, and that there was quite a bit of resistance to the idea of a rate cut in September. And I don't know that that is related to these events here now, but how does this change the outlook for rate cuts? And the idea here, which is that if the president gets a majority of the Board of Governors, he can fire, they cannot approve the district presidents for their jobs.
Look, I think there is, as you're pointing out, there are many layers to be unpacked and unpeeled here. Let's take it back to the story you're about to file, or thought you were going to file, which is first and foremost, at the Jackson Hole speech, you and I are both there. Chair Powell, I think, clearly indicated that he was at least open to the possibility of a rate cut in September. He said it may be appropriate. Markets reacted very strongly. There are a number of reasons to be cautious about even that. First, as he admitted, inflation is running above target. Second, there are tariffs upon tariffs coming ahead of us, so there's a possibility of more movements from tariffs. There's a question of how weak is the labor market. He talked in the speech about structural changes versus real weakness, so we don't really know. The unemployment rate has stayed pretty much where one thinks full employment is. As you point out, markets are sanguine. Secretary Lutnick was talking about very high equity markets. And finally, and most importantly, this is a data-dependent Fed, a lot of data left to come. So, to pick up on the story you were about to file, will there be a rate cut in September? The odds are better than 50-50, it seems. Is there the beginning of a campaign of rate cuts? I don't think there's anything that supports that. And then it goes to your point, which is if there are a number of governors that come in or a lot of political pressure, and the Fed, starts a campaign of rate cutting to meet the president's request, I think that's net negative for the economy, net negative for bond markets, and net negative for credibility.
Right. And then is that the point in time that you see more of a market reaction, or does it, as it works its way potentially through the court system, maybe even all the way up to the Supreme Court, if the court were to ratify this move, what would that say about Fed independence, about, the trust in the institution as inflation fighters?
I think there's a risk of erosion on both sides. First, how all the legal details work out. We are a country of laws, and so we do want to respect that. But it interacts with the second thing that you're talking about, that we're talking about, which is the obvious, political atmosphere, political pressure, the drumbeat, not for a cut, but cut after cut after cut. Mm-hmm. And I think if the Fed accommodates that second thing, then credibility in the Fed is shaken, mm-hmm. Credibility of the dollar is shaken, and our ability to finance our debt, I think, is weakened, not strengthened.